Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Wisdom for a World Turned Upside Down, the first evening of our Ideas and Ideals series with City Shul, hosted by Massey College. We are thrilled to have Professor Marci Shore with us and to be here at Massey. Rabbi Stephanie Crawley will share more about our agenda for this evening and the Ideas and Ideals series in a moment. But to help us begin, I'd like to introduce Massey Junior Fellow, Marissa Herzig, who leads the Junior Fellow Event Lecture Series. Have I got that right? At Massey. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of English and the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. At her undergraduate at the University of Pittsburgh, Marissa triple majored in English, French, and history, with minors in Korean and Jewish studies. Before earning her MA in English at the University of Virginia. Her SSHRC-funded dissertation examines the golem from the lens of disability studies in contemporary Jewish American women's writing. Marissa?
Thank you all for coming today. And before we begin, let me acknowledge that Indigenous nations have relationships that have endured over thousands of years with the territories in which Massey College, now 63 years old, is located. We are on the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. This land is also home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be and to work here, and we acknowledge our duty to care for and share this beautiful land. So without further ado, let me introduce these wonderful speakers that we have here today. Rabbi Stephanie Crawley is the leader of downtown Toronto City Shul's congregation. Rabbi Crawley graduated from Case Western Reserve University with a background in political science, international relations, and Jewish studies. She is a recipient of Hebrew Union College's prestigious Tisch Rabbinical Fellowship. Her rabbinic work has taken her across North America and Israel to diverse regions from Argentina to Azerbaijan. Rabbi Crawley served as associate rabbi at Temple Micah in Washington, D.C. since 2018. Professor Marci Shore is professor of intellectual history at the University of Toronto, where she specializes in the history of literary and political engagement with Marxism and phenomenology. Professor Shore is the author of Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 1968, a milieu biography of Polish and Polish-Jewish writers drawn to Marxism in the 20th century, and of The Taste of Ashes, a study of the presence of the communist and Nazi past in today's Eastern Europe. Barbara Wade-Rose, last but certainly not least, president of City Shul, is a former journalist for Maclean's, Saturday Night, The Globe and Mail, The New York Times, and many other publications. Her journalism won 2 national awards and was nominated for a 3rd. She is the author of 3 books, 2 of which were finalists in literary competitions. So let's give them all a warm round of applause.
So thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's a really exciting evening, not only because of the conversation that's about to be had, but also because tonight kicks off City Shul's new series, Ideas and Ideals, Jewish Conversations for an Uncertain Age. We, in fact, live in this most uncertain age. Events happen at a rapid pace and on a global scale. Institutions, ideas, and even relationships that once seemed stable have shown themselves to be shakier than we expected. And it can be challenging, if not impossible, to keep up, let alone to understand. And what I feel our moment lacks most is wisdom, an enduring and honest exploration of ideas that cut through noise of current events. And if it is true that a synagogue and hopefully all liberal religious institutions, is a place where we wrestle with how to live wisely, ethically, and courageously in the world as it is, then we must have access to ideas, thinkers, and conversations that help us make sense of our biggest questions. Some of these ideas, of course, are our own. Our ancient texts ground us and impel us towards preservation and care of our people, of our community, and of our world. But we need more. Judaism has never existed in a vacuum. The judicial code of the Torah is in conversation with ancient Near Eastern legal norms. The prophets are responding to what it means to be a minority experiencing external political overreach. And our sages and scholars are deeply engaged with non-Jewish philosophers and scientists. Maimonides himself implores us to accept truth from whatever sources it may be found from. Ideas and Ideals is our attempt to do this in our own time, to welcome new voices onto our Jewish bookshelf, and to enable us to engage with the most complex issues of our time. And of course, this is not just about serving the City Shul community or even the Jewish community. This is about facilitating such vital conversations in the public sphere. And to this end, we are very grateful to Massey College, a hub of ideas and intellect in Toronto, for their partnership. Much like our community of City Shul, Massey College is a place where big ideas are explored, expressed, and refined. So we are planning future conversations on responsibility, on AI and ethics, on social media, on freedom of speech, on civic responsibility, and more, and are hoping to announce a second event in the series in late spring. But I could not think of a more important conversation for us to be having this evening than the one we are about to have with Dr. Marci Shore. Tonight's conversation will explore the trend towards authoritarianism and fascism, how we might contextualize it and understand it, and what we can do as engaged citizens. Importantly, this evening is not about the news. We certainly could spend our entire evening on events that just happened in the last week. Tonight, we are hoping to have a broader discussion, trying to understand a larger narrative about how we got here and what do we do now that we are. Marci and I will each draw on our own expertises, mine, Judaism, her Eastern European political history, amongst many others. And Barbara Wade-Rose will guide us and redirect us. Our goal is to have a conversation, and to this end, we've both given Barbara permission to call us by our first names, as happens in conversations, and to interrupt us whenever she decides it's necessary. I have warned her that we might interrupt right back. So thank you again to Barbara, to Marci, and with that, let's begin.
Again, welcome. I'd like to start with an extraordinary short video put on by the New York Times, no less, about Marci and Tim Snyder and Jason Stanley about their decision to come to Canada from the United States as a response to increasing authoritarianism. And Marci beautifully expresses the moment in it. And so, Joe, if we could begin.
I'm a historian of totalitarianism.
I look at fascist rhetoric.
I've been thinking about the sources of the worst kinds of history for a quarter of a century.
Experts say the constitutional crisis is here now.
The Trump administration deporting hundreds of men without a trial.
A massive purge at the FBI to make people afraid of speaking out against him.
I'm leaving to the University of Toronto because I want to do my work without the fear that I will be punished for my words.
The lesson of 1933 is you get out sooner rather than later.
I've spent a lot of time in the last decade trying to prepare people if Trump were elected once, let alone twice.
Look what happened. Is this crazy?
I did not flee Trump, but if people are going to leave the United States or leave American universities, there are reasons for that. One thing you can definitely learn from Russians
is that it's essential to set up centers of resistance in places of relative safety.
We want to make sure that if there is a political crisis in the US, that Americans are organized.
We've just gotten started. You haven't even seen anything yet. It's all just kicking in.
My colleagues and friends, they were walking around and saying, we have checks and balances, so let's inhale, checks and balances, exhale, checks and balances. And I thought, my God, we're like people on the Titanic saying our ship can't sink. We've got the best ship, we've got the strongest ship, we've got the biggest ship, our ship can't sink. And what you know as a historian is that there is no such thing as a ship that can't sink.
The golden age of America has only just begun.
America has long had an exceptionalist narrative. Fascism can happen elsewhere, but not here.
But talking about American exceptionalism is basically a way to get people to fall into line. If you think that there's this thing out there called America, and it's exceptional, that means that you don't have to do anything. Whatever is happening, it must be freedom. And so then what your definition of freedom is just gets narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, and soon you're using the word freedom, but what you're talking about is authoritarianism.
Toni Morrison warned us.
The descent into a final solution is not a jump. It's one step, and then another, and then another.
We are seeing those steps accelerated right now.
There are some words, in Russian in particular, that I feel help us to understand what's happening in the United States, because we now have those phenomena. Произвол. It's the idea that the powers that be can do anything they want to you, and you have no recourse. This not knowing who is next creates a state of paralysis in society.
The Tufts student whose visa was removed because she co-authored an article in the Tufts student newspaper.
I thought, what would I do if guys in masks tried to grab my student? Would I scream? Would I run away? Would I try to pull the mask off? Would I try to videotape the scene? Would I try to pull the guys off of her? Maybe I would get scared and run away. The truth is, I don't know. Not knowing terrified me.
It's a deliberate act of terror. It's not necessary. It's just being done to create a spirit of us and them.
Продажность. It's a word in Russian for corruption, but it's larger than corruption. It refers to a kind of existential state in which not only everything but everyone can be bought or sold.
Critics are calling this a quid pro quo deal between Adams and President Trump.
I'm committed to buying and owning Gaza. He made $2.5 billion today, and he made $900 million.
There's an expression in Polish. I found myself at the very bottom, and then I heard knocking from below. In Russian, that gets abbreviated to there is no bottom.
We cannot allow a handful of communist radical left judges to obstruct the enforcement of our laws.
What starts to matter is not what is concealed, but what has been normalized. There's no limit to the depravity.
President Trump did not rule out the possibility of a third term.
And the sadism.
The White House released this video titled ASMR, Illegal Alien Deportation Flight.
And the cruelty that we are watching now play out in real time.
This facility is one of the tools in our toolkit that we will use.
You have to continually ask yourself the question, is this okay? Is there a line I wouldn't cross? Is there something I would not do?
People say, oh, the Democrats should be doing more, they should be fixing things. But if you want the Democrats to do things, you have to create the platform for them. You have to create the spectacle, the pageantry, the positive energy, the physical place where they can come to you.
Poland recently went through a shift towards authoritarianism. Unlike in Russia, unlike in Hungary, the media remained a place in Poland where you could criticize the regime. And as a result, democracy returned. The moral of Poland is that our democratic institutions, the media, the university, and the courts, are essential. You know you're living in a fascist society when you're constantly going over in your head the reasons why you're safe. What we want is a country where none of us have to feel that way.
I'd first like to ask Marci, in this moment, this video was made over 9 months ago, and it seems like a lot has happened since. How does this make you feel about the current moment?
Unfortunately, the current moment is not at all any more comforting than the moment in which the video was filmed. Well, let me first say thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Marisa, and thank you to Stephanie and Barbara. I'm always very excited when rabbis invite me anywhere, especially because I've always felt like I was a very bad Jew. But thank you also to Massey College, who's welcomed me so much to Toronto, and to all these graduate students I've learned so many things from at lunch, which has been a really soft landing space, at a very dark moment. It was a hard decision to come here, in part because it was a complex family decision. My husband is much more, Tim is much more of a committed American patriot, and after the elections, he would have gone back to the States, not despite the elections, but because of the elections, to fight for democracy. And I was the neurotic Jew, saying the lesson of 33 is you leave sooner rather than later. And we're really privileged to have landed in such a great place, and this is clearly a much better place for our kids. And he really agreed because of our kids, but I feel like I'm the one who pulled us away. And should take responsibility for all potential cowardice. No, I was an early panicker. I was terrified by late September 2015, when Trump first came on the scene. I would say by the second Republican primary debate, not because I was smarter than other Americans, but because I had been watching what was happening in Russia and Ukraine, and because I'm a historian of Eastern Europe. And so I saw certain patterns and I saw certain possibilities that other people might not have seen. And unfortunately now, you ask how I feel 9 months later. How I feel is that all of my neurotic apocalyptic nightmares, the kind that your therapist tells you are only in your own head and could never actually happen in the real world, you get up every morning and they're playing themselves out in the real world. And this is just not a situation where you want to be right. This is really a situation where you want to be the person who was crazy and neurotic and paranoid and clearly wrong, and things were never going to get that bad. Unfortunately, that's not the way things have gone. That Polish aphorism, I found myself at the very bottom, and then I heard knocking from below. I keep thinking about that. Again, like you think you've reached the bottom. And then you turn on the news the next day, and there's some other wild act of performative sadism, and reveling in cruelty that you think should have been unimaginable, and here it is, the new normal.
Yes, and Rabbi Stephanie, you also came from the United States and towards a position and a place, but what is this kind of thing making you think of?
You know, it was being a rabbi in Washington, D.C. is sort of a different animal than, I'd say, being a rabbi almost anywhere else, in that you're part of the conversation in an interesting and sometimes, when you're very lucky, important way. And it was a hard decision as somebody who's sort of my Judaism and my Americanism and my civic responsibility were all wrapped up in holding a particular pulpit in Washington, D.C. And for me, I'll share a little bit, one in that I was counseling people almost the entire time. One of the things that's interesting is I've been a rabbi for less than 10 years, which means that the entirety of my rabbinate has been shaped by Trump 1, COVID, Trump 2, October 7th, and beyond. So I do not know a world. I do not know a normal world. Someday I've joked that my future book is going to be about how rabbis are shaped by the world that they are ordained into, because I think sort of this has always been on my mind, and thinking about what it means to serve the Jewish people. And one of my teachers said, if that's the question, you serve the Jewish people wherever you serve the Jewish people. But I remember counseling people who would say, I want to leave, but you here at Temple Micah in Washington, D.C. are telling me to stay and fight. You here are talking about what the responsibility is to be fighting this all the time, and I would say I think all of us exist because somebody left. Every Jew that exists is alive because somebody at some point made a decision to go somewhere else, and that it's both a brave choice to leave and a brave choice to stay. And although my decision was sort of not entirely related to what was going on in the U.S., probably if I would have had my choice, not my husband's choice, who grew up in the GTA, I was really thinking about staying and fighting, and about the brave choice that was. And then City Shul came along, and I decided to go and fight the good fight somewhere else. And I'm very happy to have done that, especially now because of what I think, Marci, you and Tim have talked about saying what it looks like to establish a sort of hub for the future of this kind of thought and resistance from somewhere else. And yet I'll also share that over the last 9 months, as I've watched things unravel, it has been a challenge. It's been a challenge to be here and to watch sort of my friends and my community putting their bodies on the line on the streets and not to be standing beside them. And there also feels like a real power in saying, if and when you need to come here, I'll be here. And that feels important, but it's not without its complications, certainly.
Marci, you had talked about learning the lessons of Eastern Europe. Is there anything you think that is different about American authoritarianism, or as it's practiced by the current administration?
Well, one of the questions you always get as a historian is, how is something similar, how is something different? And of course the answer is always, everything is both similar and different. We use historical analogies and categories and concepts, be they authoritarianism, fascism, genocide, concentration camps, as hermeneutic and heuristic devices that allow us to process the irreducible particularity of reality, through concepts that give us analogies. If nothing was similar to anything else, we'd be unable to think. This kind of goes back to Kant, how concepts without intuitions are empty and intuitions without concepts are blind, and we need these metaphors and comparisons in order to make sense of the world. And so I'm always telling my students that we have to simultaneously make use of those analogies and understand their limits and not fetishize them, and also see the particularities. So there are certain patterns that are kind of classic patterns, like Tim was taught, like this us versus them. You know, at all moments of any kind of cultural, political, social anxiety, you get this attempt to divide society into us versus them. You know, and that's a prelude to what's going to be scapegoating. You know, and someone is always going to get scapegoated, and there's going to be an attempt to purge, and there's going to be an attempt to say that everything bad came from these other people, you know, be they people with dark skin, or people with a different sexuality, or people who came from a different place, or people with a red nose, or like whatever it is. Like, they're people who are in some ways other, and we're going to say everything bad came from them, and we're going to try to make ourselves feel safe because here we are among people who are like us. And these are classic patterns. You're going to mythologize the past. You know, you're going to create a version in which your particular group was always innocent and perfect and noble and brave, and all bad things came from somewhere else. But there are also, you know, there are spins. You know, there is the very particular, you know, history of the United States, which was built on slavery, which has a history of racism that was never fully acknowledged. You know, I spend most of my career, I spent trying to explain Eastern Europe to North Americans. I mean, now, for the past 10 years, I've been in this strange position of trying to explain the United States to Europeans. And I find that they're like, everybody knows we were a country built on slavery. You know, they kind of edit it out in various ways. But they don't necessarily know things like, you remind them that we sent racially segregated troops to fight the Nazis. We had miscegenation laws criminalizing, you know, racial intermarriage until 1967, you know, that's 12 years, you know, after Hitler's defeat. Like, those are things that aren't necessarily in other people's heads. So that's very particular to America. The conviction that certain things can't happen in America, the deep conviction of American essentialism, like what I was saying in this, like I really did feel like the Wednesday, the day after the elections in 2016, I really did feel like people were walking around repeating checks and balances like a yoga mantra. It was really like breathe in, checks and balances, like certain things can't happen here. This deep conviction that certain things couldn't happen here. That makes the United States different. And, you know, what makes what's happening now different from what happened, you know, in the 1930s or in the mid-20th century, you know, is this postmodern, post-truth spin that has been enabled by a technology that was completely inconceivable. And that was a part of the story, the kind of postmodern spin. We can talk about that more if you want to, on authoritarianism or fascism or neo-fascism or whatever we're going to call it, that I understood sooner because I was watching what was happening in Putin's Russia.
No, I think that's actually where I'd like to go next, because I think, you know, we have this new technology which is both being weaponized by current authoritarians and we are, to quote Neil Postman, right, amusing ourselves to death. That we are actually scrolling our way to become, that when you were talking about the knock at the bottom, I wonder, like, are we actually becoming numb? And we cannot even hear the knock that comes from below us. And that feels like it makes this moment harder and different.
You mentioned cutting through noise. Yeah. You know, and you know, Steve Bannon talks about flooding the zone.
Right.
And this is, you know, what you had, like the part of history that I've worked on a lot, you know, is dissident philosophy, among other things, in Eastern Europe. And that was a time, you know, during the communist period where you had enormous amounts of censorship, you know, and people were willing to take huge risk to smuggle censored material. You know, to students would stay up all night copying a poem so they could hand it to one other person. And there was a real faith in truth. There was a real faith that if you could get the truth out there, that would be the thing that would save us. That the problem was the truth was being repressed, it wasn't being known. And we're now in a different situation because it's less that the truth is being repressed and more that we're being flooded. And nobody can think. The number of alternative narratives that you can disseminate around the world in seconds was technologically unimaginable until very recently. And so that part is really a sui generis situation. Like, how can you think? I mean, Hannah Arendt says the source of evil is a failure to think. Right. You know, and if we know that we're supposed to think, like, I know I'm supposed to think. I'm like aware that I'm supposed to think. But even with that acute awareness, at every moment, you get up in the morning and you scroll through the news and you feel like your head is so scattered because the world historical catastrophes and the instances of cruelty and like the chains rattling on the immigrants that you're supposed to take some kind of erotic pleasure in that's being sent out by the White House, and that how do you even collect your thoughts when you're being flooded? How do you cut through the noise?
Right, and there's this quote, I think, that is yours, right? The borders of what is inconceivable start to slip, right? And then you're faced with like, not only do I not have a grasp on what I thought was impossible yesterday, but I also don't know how to think about it. And to that end, it's sort of like, what does it mean then to have to not normalize the abnormal when you no longer know what is abnormal?
No, I think that's one of the ways in which it's like so the challenge of not losing your mind. I mean, I thought one of the most profound things that was said about Trump immediately after the first election in 2016 was said by the British comedian, political satirist John Oliver. And the day after the election, he said, okay, everybody take out a Post-it note and write, "This is not normal," and put it on your refrigerator. Because soon you're going to start thinking things are normal and you're going to forget. And that was like as if a joke, but it wasn't a joke. I actually thought it was one of the most important pieces of advice.
Being in Washington the day after the election, so I was in New York City during the first Trump election, and you walked outside, and maybe it was similar here, I'm not sure, but in New York City at least, it was sitting communal Shiva. The city was silent. People were weeping on the streets. It was one of the worst days to just be out in the world. And the day after the most recent election in Washington, D.C., it was just like everybody had resigned themselves to the fact that this was, like, people were, you could see it on their faces, but it was like, okay, I still have to walk the dog. Right, and that's very much the energy that the city felt, and I've been, is like, have we already sort of resigned ourselves to maybe the fact that this is normal, and this is about surviving rather than anything else at this moment.
What struck me was the second time around was the silence rather than the reaction. One of the things you talk about in your books is about post-totalitarianism, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and enlarge its concept to the world, maybe in the coming years, and separately, how Václav Havel was the normal voice in a sea of people thinking the new totalitarianism and not doing anything was normal.
Okay, lots of questions in there. Yeah, let me first say this. The human phenomenon of the ability to normalize is one of the most interesting kind of historical topics. And you see how it's a kind of double-edged sword, because it's both what allows us to go along with things we never, ever should be complicit in, and it's also what allows people a kind of resilience to insufferable circumstances. I mean, I also say this as someone who's been, going to Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, and not at all because I'm so brave. I'm actually quite cowardly. But I'll tell a brief anecdote. I was there with my friend Amelia, who's in the back row, I think, 2 years ago, and we were at a coffee shop with. She translates a lot of Ukrainian poetry. With one of the poets whose work she translates, and the air raid siren went off. And Amelia and I, as like neurotic Americans, are ready to immediately jump down to the bomb shelter, which is generally my impulse every time the air raid siren goes off. Like, I immediately go to the bomb shelter. But Ukrainians have gotten kind of blasé about this because, if it happens all the time for years and years, you have to live your life. So we're about to jump out, and the poet we're sitting with is looking at her watch, and she's checking the Telegram channels, and she's saying, "Oh, it's this kind of missile. We have 27, 28 minutes. We can finish our coffee." Like. We're like, okay, now, and you can see how, like, okay, she's normalized a state of affairs that's clearly abnormal that nobody should have to normalize. And you also see how that's a survival mechanism that has been in some ways extraordinarily inspiring. But the other side of that is that, oh yes, we're wrenching a 3-year-old away from his parents, on the US-Mexican border and throwing him in a cage. And, well, that's just the kind of thing that happens. So we kind of forget and we turn away. And that's... That part of the human condition is something that I think we can only be aware of. So you asked about post-totalitarianism. So the tricky thing about that is that term gets used in different ways. Most famously, Václav Havel uses it in an essay called The Power of the Powerless, which I think everyone knows now because Mark Carney cited it at Davos, which was such a moving moment for me. For the past 25 years, I have made all my students read that essay. And there was a joke at Yale that I didn't let anyone graduate until they read Havel's The Power of the Powerless. And it seems like a kind of obscure text of Czech dissident philosophy, which is kind of a niche topic. And so I felt so vindicated. I mean, not only did Mark Carney use it at Davos, but he used it exactly on point, exactly as Havel intended that paradigm of the greengrocer to be. And what Havel was talking about when he said post-totalitarian is he said it's not that it's not totalitarian per se, and we can talk about what totalitarianism means, is that he was talking specifically about that post-1968 moment in communist Czechoslovakia. And in distinction to the Stalinist period, which was far more bloody, but was a time of sincere ideological conviction, the time after the Czechoslovak experiment with socialism with a human face, and the attempt to find a kinder, gentler socialism. It was violently put down by Soviet, formerly Warsaw Pact tanks in the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And after that, the cat was out of the bag. After that, everybody knew that this system was forced on them. After that, everybody knew that nobody any longer believed. Everyone knew that the emperor was naked. Everyone knew that the Grand Inquisitor had one secret. He did not believe in God. But everyone continued to go through the rituals. So Havel is talking about this moment where, the greengrocer goes into his shop every morning and he hangs the sign saying, "Workers of the world unite," and he doesn't believe it. And the people passing by don't believe it. And even the communists running the country don't believe it. And the regime knows that the people don't believe, and the people know that the regime knows, and everybody knows that everybody knows, but everyone goes on pretending. And this is what he means by post-totalitarian, and he says, even though there's no real belief, we are still all complicit in allowing this oppression to go on. And this is why when Mark Carney said, and Havel says, well, what else can he do? I mean, the greengrocer is going to get into a lot of trouble if he takes down the sign. And Havel says, well, why would he get into trouble? And he says, well, he'd get into trouble because actually hanging the sign that no one believes in is very important to the regime. And if one day everyone takes down the signs, that's the beginning of a revolution. And therefore, the greengrocer is not so powerless. After all, in fact, he's quite powerful and therefore responsible and also guilty because we're all allowing the system to go on. And so when Carney stood up there at Davos and said, it's time to take down the signs, that was really an incredible moment for me as a person who newly came to Canada to see.
And just so everyone knows, you might have missed this, but Havel made an appearance in my Yom Kippur morning sermon of this year. So we have two people reading dissident Czech philosophy, slightly different context. But to that end, actually, I think city Schulers have heard me say this. Often I ask the question of why we go to synagogue. What the point of it is and what we're doing there. And I have to think, actually, some of it is, in particular in a moment like right now, it's an opportunity to be in a space where we are confronted with what is normal, and then to be able to say that's not normal. Like, that's what the prophets are doing. The prophets are walking through their society and saying, actually, all these people are holding festivals when there are other poor people in the street. That's not normal, right? That there are ways that the world is working, and they're using the language of prophecy, but I think what they're actually often talking about is like this deep conviction and woundedness that they're the only ones that have the only ones that have the courage to say it out loud. And for me, at least, reading these ancient texts and being in sort of a sanctuary kind of moment is not about shutting everything else outside. It's actually about saying, I've been feeling that 6 days a week I'm walking through the world having to pretend like everything is normal, and here I allow myself to be confronted with some sort of actual truth. Whether we think the truth is divine or whatever else, it's to say that there is real truth out there. And I sort of wonder, particularly like if we're talking about all the things that make this moment different than other moments. We have social media. We have the particularism of like an Americanness that feels like it's slipping into this. But we also have fewer solid religious institutions than we ever have before. And I wonder how that plays into it.
That's really interesting, because as you were saying that, I was feeling like that's how I felt about being in the classroom. And the day after the election in 2016, I was like lying on the floor of my office that Wednesday morning at Yale and throwing up into a plastic bag and thinking like there was no point in even like getting up and going to my seminar because nobody was going to be there. But I did. I like got up, and I went to the class, and all the students were there, and they were there early, and they were waiting for me like with like these bloodshot eyes. And I remember the first one to talk said, Professor Shore, is it going to be okay? And of course I couldn't say yes. Like, I knew very well it was not going to be okay. And of course, if you're like the teacher or like the mother figure, or like you don't want to tell these bright young people, no, it's not going to be okay. But I couldn't lie to them. But I also that was the moment where I felt like it's really important we're here together. Yeah. And that and being in the classroom after those elections grounded me. I think in a similar way.
I think so, and what the synagogue has that a classroom does not is that we all get that it's open to everyone in a different sort of way, right? And one of the things that I've thought about is the fact that in the absence of everybody having access to a university or really strong civic institutions, that a resurgence of good liberal religious organizations maybe should be an answer for cultivating this kind of conversation and that space. I mean, I'm thinking a beloved teacher of mine just died 2 weeks ago, and it was her classroom that was the first classroom I went to in 2016 after going on the subway, sitting Shiva in New York City, and we all cried, and then the next day, or maybe a week later, she said, I have a new project. She reached out to 100 religious leaders across the United States, and each one of them wrote a letter to the new administration for the first 100 days. And it was completely interfaith, and it was something to do. It gave us language, and it gave us a sense of solidarity, and it gave us community in a way that, I think you're right, that the not only the sort of classroomness of it, but the space to be able to react and respond to something together is really important. But then we get back into the conversation, which is it's also the universities and the institutions of conversations like this that authoritarians go after first. Right, and then what do we do when those are stolen from us?
Yeah, no, I mean that's been something our friend Jason, who you just saw in the video, he was also very committed to staying in the States, and he accepted the offer at Monk after Columbia capitulated. I mean, his decision was much more immediately, and he's like, okay, the institutions they're not necessarily going to hold up. Like we need them, and they're not necessarily going to hold up, and we can't count on them. I'm not an institution person. I've never been good at thinking through institutions. I've only really kind of been good at thinking on individual levels. But one thing I can see, like I talked about that Russian word proizvol, this word for arbitrariness that's kind of always already tinged with tyranny and the potential for terror, and that the way that works, or at least the way historically it works, is this sense of you never know who will be next. There's no safe space because anyone can be targeted. And how that works sort of sociologically, or at least through phenomenological observation, is that people retreat into themselves. They become very atomized and alienated, and that's one way that these authoritarian regimes worked on people, by atomizing and alienating people, and so then the stakes of finding some space of community, that to ground us, or even just to make us feel less alienated and isolated, the stakes suddenly go up, and then they're under attack precisely at the moment when they're most crucial.
In this context, and at this moment, in each of your realms, what is courage?
I think a lot about moral courage. Right now, I think that moral courage is actually to try to hold complexity in a world that wants us to think with a lot more simplicity. I think that courage actually has to look different than maybe that makes it more complicated, because courage can be standing on the streets of Minnesota. And courage can also mean like having the hardest conversations with your family members. And I think we need to validate each of those pieces of courage, and also in whatever way we can, to try to understand ourselves as part of a bigger conversation. And courage in some ways, actually, as I think about it, and I think Hava would agree with this, actually, is about understanding how both significant and insignificant you are in a particular moment. That is like, it is about my role and my sort of drop in the bucket, but the more drops in the bucket, then at some point the bucket will overflow. And there's a piece of courage, actually, that's sort of letting go of our own desires for a bigger project. I think this is what we saw in the streets of Iran, right? To say, like, they knew what they were doing when they walked there, when they walked out onto the streets. And it's courage to that, and it's courage to sort of like honor that and lift that up. And it's courage to speak truth out loud. In an era that wants us to be liked, that we want to be liked, it's courage to say things that make you unpopular. Maybe I'll come back with more, but that's what I got for you.
Oh, it's a really good question, and I think in some ways it's different for everybody, because if we assume that courage is what you do despite fear, we're all afraid of different things. Like, the thing that I'm afraid of is not necessarily the thing that you're afraid of. It's not universal. Like, I'm terrified of snakes. Not everybody is terrified of snakes. But it's something I've thought a lot. It's something I've thought a lot about in the context of Russia and Ukraine. And the calls to cancel Russians, regardless of who they may be. And I think about some of my Russian friends and colleagues who are just so much braver than I would ever be. And who have been willing to risk their lives, again and again. And I have a lot of friends in Eastern Europe, now once only friends of an older generation who, fought against communist oppression and sat in prison at the time, and now kind of tragically also friends who are even younger than I am who have been tortured in Russian captivity or fought at the front, or people who have done extraordinary things, journalists who have been on the front line again and again and again. And so I'm constantly very aware of these models, of courage. And I've also had a lot of friends and colleagues give me a lot of, I think, undeserved credit for, say, Marci, you've been so courageous, you're writing and speaking the truth again and again. And I said, that's not really courage. I mean, that doesn't require, I can't actually imagine writing and not writing the truth. I mean, I could be wrong about something. At any given point, I could be mistaken, and I'm sure sometimes I am mistaken. But I can't imagine even having the desire or temptation to speak out and not say the truth. But if you're going to talk, this is my kind of idealistic, having been, raised in the spirit of Havel. Like, if you're going to go, you put pen to paper, you speak the truth. And I've never felt afraid of that. Whereas physically, I'm a coward. I don't think I would hold up for 20 seconds in situations where somebody was actually firing a gun at me. Whereas I know other people can do that. Other people seem to have that ability to face beatings, and face violence and face missiles.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, God forbid any of us should ever need to have that kind of courage. And if we think, and, my French is non-existent, but the word courage means open heart, right, in French. And that actually, like, to have an open heart is the response. Like, if we think about Hannah Arendt, if we think about Havel, if we think about if we think about, like, all of the people who are telling us how to respond to a moment, it's also about saying it's not just about where your body is, it's also about where your heart is. And are you closed off or are you open? Right? And that is its own courage, I think, to not let the world harden you. Because the second you do, then you're completely unable to act. And so I think it is, like, if we're talking about, like, what it means for us to cultivate courage, when none of us are putting our bodies on the line in a particular way, thank God right now, that it is about saying, I'm cultivating an open heart. And I don't want to sound overly spiritual or naive, but I actually think that that's an act of resistance, is reopening our hearts when the world wants us to harden them, when we want to numb ourselves, when we want to distract ourselves, that this is also, again, like, I come back always to the prophets, but they want us to break our hearts over and over again. And that takes courage. It takes courage to open up the news and cry every day, which I do pretty much every day. And it takes courage to want to then continue to do that and continue to be in the world instead of retreat. Because that's how the people who wish to oppress win, right? Is if we close off our hearts to each other, to the other, and even to ourselves, to the deeper parts of ourselves.
One of the things I remember from, back when Obama was running in 2008, and I read his book, Dreams from My Father, and one of the things I thought was remarkable about him was that he had that balance between sensitivity and some kind of resistance. Like, how can you be open enough to take in the pain and suffering of the world, but still somehow resistant enough not to be crushed by it? Because it's very easy you take in the pain and suffering, and it's so overwhelming that you just want to jump off a cliff or hide in bed and never get up, or you're callous and you're not taking in the world, and you're not opening to the world, and you're resistant to empathizing with other people's pain, and then you're not helping either. So that balance between the openness and then not being crushed by the extraordinary pain of it is, how does one find that balance?
Is there a way a country can find courage? I'm thinking a little bit of the one you came to.
I mean, I would even ask, I think we're seeing with both Zelensky and Carney new leaders of the free world in a way that look differently than ever before, right? Like, It used to be that the leaders of the free world were the people with the most money and the strongest military, but now we're looking at other people who are people of courage. What is that like? I don't know. What do you talk about Zelensky? Because he's my favorite Jewish person right now. So other than Ruthie, my daughter. Yeah.
No, shortly after the full-scale invasion, I got a call from the editor of the Jewish Review of Books saying, please write something about Zelensky as a Jew. I said, I'm not an expert on Zelensky as a Jew. He said, we need something of Zelensky as a Jew.
And a comedian.
And a comedian, which is also which is a whole other very interesting topic. So I had been completely an agnostic about Zelensky, before. I didn't speak publicly one way or the other. I didn't have any sense of whether he was going to be a good thing or a bad thing for Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine was by far not a perfect country. It was really struggling to, get itself out of kleptocratic oligarchy and enormous corruption. But after, there were two moments. I mean, the first was, February 23rd in the evening, hours before what turned out to be the invasion. Zelensky gave an address not to Putin and not to the Kremlin, but directly to the Russian people. And I don't know how widely this was disseminated or listened to, for non-Russian speakers, but because it was very particular in Russian. There was an intimacy in it that only a native speaker could have spoken to other native speakers that way. And he turned to the Russians as he knew that at any moment now Putin could order this invasion, and said, please don't do this. This is not what we want our relationship with you to be. He said, if you come here and try to kill us, well, we will defend ourselves, but this is not what we want. And there was something this was someone who was a native Russian speaker who had worked in the Russian film industry, who had a lot of friends in Russia, and that was the first moment where I was really moved by Zelensky. There was something about that, that 10-minute address that really got to me. And then just hours later, there was the invasion. And then the moment when this part was widely disseminated, I'm sure you all remember it, when Zelensky goes out onto the street in Kiev, after the Americans offer to evacuate him, and there's assassination squads looking for him, and he goes out onto the streets with 3 other guys from his presidential administration at night in Kiev, and forms that selfie video, and says, I, the president, am here. We are here. We are not running away. And I thought, whatever happens afterwards, that is a historic moment, and that was a decision in the deepest existentialist sense of decision making, and the world will be different because that man made that decision.
And I think that's actually sort of how I also understand what courage looks like, right? Havel says that hope is doing something not because it'll work out, but because it makes sense. And that's the line that I think about all the time, right? He's doing the thing that he feels like makes the most sense, and that will ultimately be, whether or not it's successful ultimately, I think he becomes somebody that we understand as people standing up to tyrants as possible. And for me, his Judaism is so part of that. And I don't know that he even can articulate that, or that's just me superimposing it. But the fact that he sort of knows that in his bones, to me, feels so Jewish. That he knows that the important thing is today to stand up to a tyrant, and tomorrow to stand up to a tyrant, whatever that means.
I mean, you asked about comedy, and one of the things I found interesting about Zelensky is, so I was talking to my brother, who is an opera composer, and had, it's nothing in particular to do with Eastern Europe except through me, but has spent a lot of time working with, he's also a professor of music, and working with comic theater and working with comic actors and singers. And I was in the days and weeks after the full-scale invasion, I was blown away by how well Zelensky was holding up. I'm like, this is a man who has no experience, who would have any experience to be in this situation? I mean, I'm sure I would have crumbled within the first half second, but that he was holding up so well in these circumstances. And my brother suddenly said, Dan is like, oh, I'm not surprised. I'm like, how are you not surprised? I mean, how do you even, he's like, it's all the skills a good comic actor has. You have to be able to think quickly on your feet. You have to be able to improvise. You have to be open to whatever is coming at you, even if it's not the thing that you expected. You need that little bit of ironic distance that breaks the mimesis, that breaks that mimetic reaction. And I saw that in Zelensky. I saw like the moments where, where the Russian propaganda is kind of pulling you in, like, you're parasites, you're fascists, you're Nazis, like, and he had this, like, if you listen too carefully to what these guys are saying, you would just go hang yourself. So we've got to kind of like put this on the side. I mean, there's, he had that bit of ironic distance, at certain moments that I could see was sanity producing, and I could then see how that came from comedy, that came from the theater.
I'll go. Okay. I sort of want to. I want us to make sure that we talk about two things, sort of a little bit about Judaism. But before that, I want to get us slightly somewhere more hopeful, which is to say, often this statistic is thrown around that all you need is 3% of a population to overturn an authoritarian. And we saw that in Poland, right? We saw that, like, in the video. Is that statistic still true? Does it work in really big places? And, like, what does it take in 2026?
It's a great question. I mean, this is a social science-y question. It's the sociologists who have the numbers, who feel like they've figured it out. But there is something, I mean, like in 2022, I was talking to a Ukrainian friend who was working in Washington at the time, and I was like, Vlad, what would it take for there to be a revolution in Russia? And he said, 2 million people in the streets of Moscow, it's over tomorrow. I said, how do you know it's 2 million? Is 1.9 million not enough? Like, when is it the one additional person? Because there's always a tipping point. 500 people go out on the streets, and they did. You arrest them all. 5,000 go out, you arrest them all. When do you hit that tipping point? And I mean, it's one that we were thinking about during the Ukrainian Revolution and the Maidan in 2013, 2014. Like, you need a critical mass of people willing to cross to the other side of fear at the same time. And then there's the additional question. Do they need to be willing to use violence? I was sure, in watching Belarus in August 2020, I was sure they had it. And they were so brave. They were so brave, and that was such an inspiring resistance movement. And there were these feminist philosophers that played a key role, and I thought they were brilliant. And they had, like, the social contract had been broken. Nobody loved Lukashenko, and they were crushed by pure violence. And I was sure they had it in terms of numbers. And so when, like, the women in Iran, 2022, like, I mean, the Iranian people have been so brave, like, again and again and again. So what is that 3%, but the 3%, does it have to be 3%, all of whom are willing to die at the same time? Does it have to be 3% speaking out? 3%, like, 3% doing exactly what? But that's the mystical thing, because there's always a tipping point. At some point, there's a tipping point.
My last question to both of you, or each of you, would be that what is the thing you want everyone to understand? If you could get all of North America to understand one message, one next step, one idea, what would it be?
Oh, I mean, one thing I try to talk to students about a lot is that there is no such thing as genetic immunity to the fascist temptation, to the temptation to, work out your resentments by projecting them on a scapegoat, to making yourself feel safe by retreating into a protected space among your own and drawing these lines. There's no, not Jews, not Poles, not Ukrainians, not Americans, like, none of us gets this genetic immunity. Like, these are, it's work. It's work, it's thinking, and thinking is work. And one thing I feel like you're always, like the most basic thing you're always doing in the classroom is you're trying to teach students to make that imaginative leap and understand how things look from someone else's point of view. Even if it's just an exercise, and even if they're not going to agree, and even if they're not going to like that point of view. And that's work. It's effort. Like, it doesn't just come naturally in some sense. You've got to focus on it. But it can be done. I don't think we're genetically wired to be fascists, but I also don't think we're genetically wired with some kind of immunity to it. In that sense, it's on us. And we have to accept that responsibility.
I mean, I think that is a really important piece, is to actually say, in a large system, where am I responsible? And I really appreciate that. I think, like, the things that I would want people to know, like, things that I hold really deeply, is this sort of idea of moral imagination, which also says, like, if you are not imagining the future, then you're living in someone else's vision of the future, and most often, that's not a place you want to live in. And so, like, what it actually takes to sort of cultivate moral imagination, I think, is a really important part of this. But it's also it's doing the work of saying, like, really what hope is, which is hope, like, locates itself in the premises of the unknown. If I knew, like, to even go back where you started, it's like you had these fears, and we've gotten there. Like, a lot of your worst fears have come to fruition, and still we don't know what the future is. Like, there could be something underneath us, there could be more bottom, but there also could be a way to climb out. And the worst thing that we could possibly do in this moment is say that the story is over, that things have already been written. And the best possible thing that we could do is to say, actually, I don't know, therefore I'm going to try to imagine myself into a better future. And I'm going to work with as many people as possible to try to get on board with what that version of imagination is. The other piece that I would say is, like, is to come back to what's Weber's version of democracy, the rubbing away at the slow wood, is to say, like, we're actually part of something that's so long and so enduring, and you want revolution, but actually, like, the slowness of fighting this and setting up the right kind of institutions is better. And that's what I would say to everybody. And then particularly to Canadians, I think I'm sort of coming in, like, Americans, for all the issues with American exceptionalism, I, like, walked through the world for most of my life as though I had like a divine purpose to tell everybody that democracy and, like, equality was the right way to be in the world. And I think that mantle has been handed to Canadians. And not in a superiority kind of way, but actually to say, like, if this idea of, like, having good government that just takes care of people is real for you, then there's something about saying that actually we need to continue to try to make that truer for ourselves and truer for the world.
Let me just jump in with one more thing about that. So I was in Vienna in 2013, 2014 on leave from Yale during the revolution in Ukraine. And watching it largely from afar, and at a research institute where I had several friends and colleagues shuttling back and forth between Vienna and Kiev. And I became completely captivated. Like, I knew in all the years I had been hanging out in Eastern Europe, this was the first real revolution that I was watching. And I was seeing it, to some extent, largely through the eyes of my Polish friends who were veterans of Solidarity, who were watching what was happening on the Maidan as people were being transformed, not just politically, but existentially, as people were finding within themselves kinds of selflessness and courage and generosity, and willingness to work for a better future, including for strangers who were standing next to them who they never otherwise would have encountered, who were finding this solidarity with people across religious and ethnic and linguistic and generational differences. And I saw that my Polish friends who were veterans of Solidarity knew better than anyone else that kind of solidarity between the fathers and the sons and the workers and the intellectuals and the Jews and the Catholics and the leftists and the right. They knew better than anyone else that it lasted 20 seconds after communism fell. But they also knew that it was this precious gift that most people never experience in their lifetimes, and they never counted on living to see a second time. And they appreciated it when they saw it. And what I saw in Ukraine was not that I never thought, okay, well, everyone's going to live happily ever after now. But to me, watching the Maidan was a reminder that we human beings are capable of something better. Even if we only ever see it for a flicker of a second, even if it historically comes out rarely, even if it's fragile, even if it's ephemeral, the fact that it can be there, even for a moment, is evidence that it is possible, that we have that capacity within ourselves for something better. And that's what I hang on to now for hope.
And you just have to think, like, that's why in, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, we're going to tell the story of the Exodus again. Right? Like, there actually is the ability to escape and to walk from the constricted place and to go into freedom. And for us, sometimes it's more of a metaphor, sometimes it's less of a metaphor, but you have to think that for 2,000 years, actually telling that story meant something, right? Whether it's telling it mythically or telling it actually, that these cycles happen and that we hold on to it, even if it's going to go away, even if there's another Egypt and another Egypt and another Egypt.
Thank you, Stephanie Crawley, and thank you, Marci Shore. We'd be happy to take any questions you might have. I see arms. Our Q&A person will be Jonathan Rose.
I'm not going to need a microphone.
Yeah, I know. I'll give it to you.
Okay.
And who was the interim?
There's a mic there.
The interim principal of Massey College in 2024, and an all-round startup guy.
All right, let's run this one. You're up. You're going to have to put that down.
It's also a good opportunity to stretch. First of all, allow me to commend all three of you. In your unique manner or way, you have parsed the conversation most excellent. These are tremulous times. We all recognize that. And yes, with the 3%. My comment, question, query to the two of you, notwithstanding the interlocutor in the middle, is somewhat similar. In a sense, we talk about courage. I'm thinking of Antoine Saint-Exupéry, not necessarily a very good pilot, but a very good writer who did the rêve extraordinaire, the dream in terms of what ought to be, what could be manifested, and used flight or aviation as his leitmotif. We are now in times which are astringent. And my comment is, what responsibility do we hold to those enablers? And I'm just reflecting on Otto Klemperer from his diaries, because he intimated very much what you said, Professor Shore, in terms of the tremulous times. And we all are living in a state of unknown. So what do we do with the enablers? How do we reach out to them? How do we assuage them or inspire them to stand up and be counted as a Daniel in the lion's den? Thank you.
Oh, the how to reach people is the million-dollar question, which I bang my head against the wall every day, because we always have this feeling that you're speaking in a bubble, that we're speaking to people who already agree with us, and how do you reach out? There's a moment in Eichmann in Jerusalem where Arendt says, in situations of terror, most people will comply, but some people will not. And the fact that some people will not is enough justification for the continued existence of human beings on the planet. She's kind of modest in her expectations that way. But no, this question of when can you reach people and how can you reach people, and when do you break through, and what kind of language do you use, and who do you write for? And, I feel... When I talk to really young people, like when I get a chance to go talk to teenagers or go out into secondary schools, that's when in some ways I feel most like there's a possibility. And I think because I'm then getting people who are not yet formed, who are still impressionable, who are still open. My own kids are teenagers too. I was recently at the World Affairs Conference at a private school here that was hosting it for high school students all over North America, and I felt like they were really listening, and they still hadn't made up their minds about things yet, and then you had this chance to kind of introduce ideas that they hadn't thought of. But the question of how do you go out into Appalachia? How do you go face Trump voters? How do you break through? And I bang my head against the wall about this every day. I don't feel like I found a good solution at all.
I think I'm pretty naive about this, but it's a redeemable naivete, I think, in that I feel that the more truth you can tell, and the more real and human you can be, ultimately people will respond to it. And then that's really all that, not all we can do, that's the job. And so I don't always think about how am I getting whatever message out to the masses? It'll happen. Speaking the truth out loud is the thing that matters. And the metaphor maybe is that at some point, if I scream the truth loud enough, even if I'm in a container, the walls will break and people will hear it. And then that's the job. And it's, because maybe it's not going to Appalachia. Maybe it's not actually forcing people who aren't ready to have the conversation, but it's about holding on to the truth so that when people are ready, it's there.
So thank you so much. This was an amazing, amazing talk. I usually get really bored and look at my phone, and I was just completely locked in. But there is something that I feel is missing from the conversation. So you both say that you're here partially because you had to leave the U.S., and I can't imagine what that would be like to have to go through. And as a Canadian, I've never had to do that. And watching what goes on in the U.S., I've been appalled. But at the same time, as a Jew, I do not feel safe in Toronto. I do not feel like our government has our back. And you say you're here because you feel it's safer for your children, but I see police in front of our schools. I see the signs at Bathurst and Shepherd on the weekend that were images from the Holocaust. I see our premier, who at the last minute tried to get an injunction for Al-Quds Day as a stunt. And so my question is yes, it is better than Trump. Absolutely, that's my personal opinion, and others have different opinions. But it is still incredibly distressing, and I feel like I'm living in a world under siege in Canada, and I'm just wondering, do you have any hope for us? Or do we have to go to Panama or Israel?
I really appreciate the question. So my daughter's 2.5. I'm sort of two versions of this story, or two stages of the story. And she went to school for the first time. She was with a nanny when we were living in Washington, D.C. And the first day she ever went to school was the day that there was this terrible school shooting in Minnesota. And my mother called me, just totally distraught. And there was this amazing thing to feel like, to be able to say, that doesn't happen here. And so I hold on to that really deeply. It does feel like a safer place for me to be raising my daughter in. And then there's this piece that you talk about. And I don't know that we have a great answer for this. I think, and part of it is that, I have just made up my mind that Judaism instructs me to live a certain way, and nobody else gets to decide whether or not I love the stranger. No stranger gets to decide whether or not I follow that instruction. And so it's figuring out like how we use each and every one of the moments where people express hate to us to make our hearts bigger, to make ourselves more capacious. I think it is the hardest thing to do. I think it is an incredibly hard thing. I don't think being a Jew in the world is meant to be an easy project. Like, I think it's actually, like, if you're doing it right, it should be impossible, and you're still working at it every day. And that's one of the pieces, is to say, like, how am I opening myself? And how am I working to get out of a sort of sense of a silo, of a Jewish silo, and to reach out more and to develop more relationships and to figure out what it means. I think often of this phrase of like what it means to have a keter shem tov, the crown of a good name. Like, what are we doing every day in the world to make sure that every single person in Toronto, if they're paying attention, cannot say a bad thing about the Jewish people? And ultimately, that'll be the thing that helps. And again, maybe it's naive, but I want to live there because I certainly don't want to live somewhere else. And that's my answer. And it's certainly an incomplete one. And I hope that it continues to not have to. I hope that in the future it's not a question at all. Yeah.
I'll give maybe a slightly different answer to the same question. The first thing is a very basic thing in that it's all relative. I mean, I was living in New Haven for almost 20 years. There's shootings all the time in New Haven. And not only in New Haven, but I mean, the United States is the country with the highest per capita firearm ownership rate, in the world. And so there's just even if Trump had not won this election, I was very tempted to take these offers at Monk. Like, I just wanted to get away from the everyday violence. From the fact that if you show up in the emergency room when your kid has a broken arm in New Haven on a Saturday night, everyone else has been shot. Police are there and people are screaming and threatening the nurse. I mean, there's a constant atmosphere of violence. So it's not that I think Canada or any other place is perfect, but there is a kind of relative disparity about violence, and especially gun violence. The other thing is that, I mean, I do think that there is no such thing as a safe space. I mean, I'll tell a very short anecdote. When my son was young, I unfortunately have passed along to him my anxiety, which I tried very hard not to do, but clearly not hard enough. So you all see I have a lot of anxiety. And he was having trouble falling asleep, and I said, what's wrong? And he said, Mommy, I feel like home isn't a safe space or a safe place. And I said, why do you feel that way? And he said, well, I was just thinking, like, a meteor could come hit the house, or a storm could come blow the roof off, or, what if a robber, an axe murderer, breaks in through the window? And my impulse was to say, I know exactly how you feel. Like, I'm afraid of all those things too. But the problem is that not at home carries the same risk. And the tragedy of the human condition is that there is no safe place in the world. But I feel like therapists all over the world would be very proud that I restrained myself from giving him that answer. And I said, no, don't worry. Everything's fine. No meteor's going to come. No axe murder is going to come. It's all fine here. But basically, I felt like, yes, that is there is no safe space in the world. And we're constantly looking for safe spaces. And that's always a kind of utopian fantasy, not necessarily one that should not be pursued, because we should try to make things safer. But in some ways, I just don't believe there is such a thing.
Has he come out of his room yet?
Yes, he now does come out of his room, and he runs around Toronto. But yeah, he still understands that the world is, alas, not a safe space.
So thank you so much for this. Rabbi Hillel Talmud says that in a place where there are no people, where there are no mensches, be a mensch. Yeah? And so this idea of you being a bad Jew, you're a great Jew. No, I'm serious. And this is not... This is what Jews do. When there's craziness and totalitarianism and pharaohs, we stand up and say, that's not the way the world has to be. And we're still in the U.S., so we're working on this. But then we have this other complicating factor, and I have no pleasure in saying this, that there's another place where we feel connected, this country across the planet, we're supposed to be, Jewish place, and there's another totalitarian, autocratic thing happening there. you know, there's like, Trump is doing his thing and taking out the press and targeting minorities and taking away legal status for people who deserve it. And then, you know, the Netanyahu government's doing the same thing. And as smart Jews, and I'm really counting on your wisdom, I don't have the answer. Like, what do we do when the place that's supposedly representing us is now actually telling the United States, like, hey, you should criminalize criticism of this government? And the Jews are like, yeah, that's right. Like, no, but wait, but we're the Jews. We're supposed to be talking about justice and righteousness. And we're being told, no, follow those talking points. How do we, as the truth tellers and the justice pursuers, how do we navigate that? I need your all three of you, the wisdom to do that.
So, you know, it's sort of a joke line, but one of who, I can't even remember who said it, but it's Jews are like everyone else, only more so. Henry Kynan, right? And so in some ways it's like, of course, that like, if no one is immune from certain trends, like these things can happen, you know, and then I feel like, so the only answer I'll give you because I think like, because Israel could derail our entire conversation, we would be here, and we can't. There's no cookies, so I can't keep you for much longer without feeding you. Is the answer that I have comes from a political philosopher who I love, Michael Walzer, who says that we have to be that the best critic is the one who's the connected critic. And that the only way that you really have the ability to make an impact is to be the connected critic. If you've read any of the Hebrew Bible, or you remember sitting in Yom Kippur services and hear Jonah, it's Jonah's big problem. Jonah does not care at all what happens to the Ninevites. Right? They're supposed to repent. They actually do. And then he gets angry because it doesn't align with his vision of justice. And I think Jonah is there to tell us, actually, the responsible way and the effective way of being in the world is to be a connected critic within our own communities, and also with this place that many of us love. Me included. Like, and so the thing that I continually come back to is that my responsibility with both of the homes that I love, the U.S. and Israel, is to stay as deeply connected as I can, so that I can have as much of a voice and as much credibility as I can. And it doesn't change any particular thing on the ground at the moment, but it gives me two legs to stand on.
Yeah, Israel is a country that I feel like breaks your heart again and again and again. There's Leon Wieseltier last year wrote, you know, a very kind of wrenching essay about exactly like how he had two great loves and two great homes, and they've both broken his heart. No, and it's an excellent question. I mean, I feel the way you do. Like the moral obligation is neither to disavow a connection that would be disingenuous to say I have no connection, but also to speak the truth and not to pretend something is okay that's not okay. You know, to call evil what's evil, you know, to look at evil and say this is evil. I mean, I think burying children under rubble, you know, is always everywhere in every context evil. And something I've thought a lot about in relation to Ukraine. I do a lot of outreach, for instance, in Ukrainian literature, which is something I love. I've dabbled in some translation and Russophone Ukrainian literature. I promote authors, which I love to do. I think they have a fantastic literature. But I get very nervous when I hear people say, like, look, you know, these children are heirs to a great literary tradition. It's a moral atrocity to bury them under rubble. And I'm like, no. Any argument that makes human rights contingent upon cultural accomplishments is a moral trap. You know, that has to be a priori. Some things have to be evil a priori, always, everywhere, in every circumstance. And like that grounds me. And the other very brief Toronto anecdote I'll tell, and this is very much from the point of view of a historian who is so acutely aware of these moments of contingency. is that I was in Israel for the first time in 1989, during the Intifada, and it seemed hopeless to me. I mean, I felt like I was watching lots of horrible things, and I was very disillusioned, and I couldn't stand the racism, and I thought the violence didn't seem like it was going to go away. And then in Prague in the summer of '93, on an old black and white little television, I was watching the Oslo Accords. And it seemed extraordinary. It seemed like suddenly this moment opened up. And then in November 1995, I was actually doing my MA here in Toronto, and I was asleep, and I get this call from a friend who is actually, who defected from Soviet Ukraine, who was also doing his MA here, who was much older than I was, who'd had 9 lives already, served in the Soviet army. He was a Jew from Soviet Lviv. And he called and wakes me up, and he's screaming on the phone. He's like, the bastards, they killed him. And I'm like, Alexander, who, what's going on? What are you talking about? And that was Rabin's assassination. And now I look back and think, if those bullets had missed, we would be in a different world.
I think we have time for one more question, but I just want to emphasize that, call Uber and get some cookies. But Jonathan, do you mind? Rob has had his hand up. And then I think around non-cookies, we can have some more conversations.
I was going to ask about the cookies. But you made the point very clearly that the lesson of 1933 is that you get out. But presumably also the lesson of 1933 is that there was some date before 1933 when there were other options that were not taken. That there was a time before 1933 that was the time to seriously organize political resistance and break through complacency and get out in protests, in whatever you can, before you risk being beaten or disappeared or shot on the spot. And I want Canada to remain a place where Americans can organize, outside resistance, but that's only true if we stay safe and sane. And we have a right-wing party with shadow cabinet members that have dinner with German AfD members, right? And I feel like maybe we're at a point where we should all be willing to skip work tomorrow and go to the Ontario legislature because our premier is trying to exempt himself from freedom of information laws, right? But we're probably, none of us are going to. So what do we do? How do we do that? How do we bring ourselves to that pre-1933 time now and do what we can do to avoid then?
It's a great question. The thing you see as a historian are all these moments of contingency. I mean, people obsess classically about things like if Hitler had been accepted at the art school in Vienna, which the historian James Sheehan once called the single worst admissions decision in the history of higher education. But I mean, there were all these moments, right, where things could have been different. And the problem with being a historian is not that you know what will happen, but you have a sense of what can happen. And the possibilities are generally more capacious than what we imagine. It's often a kind of failure of imagination, And so I think part of it is continually the effort to think, to continually ask ourselves, well, what if, and what about this, and not just to think like, oh, whatever, it'll all be okay. Because there is no whatever, it'll all be okay. It's basically always on us. It's always on us, and there's always a combination of human decision and human agency and chance and the structures into which we're thrown and that kind of cocktail, and that's a lot of effort and the impulse to check out, and to say either it's going to be okay or it's not going to be okay, but whatever it's very, very tempting. I mean, I tell my students that, I find thinking exhausting too. This is why I go to spinning classes, because there's like a whole hour where you have to lock your phone outside the class and blindly follow the instructions of the, of the instructor while you're on a stationary bicycle and really can't destroy the world in any way because your possibilities are circumscribed. You're on a stationary bicycle. But of course I could ride a stationary bicycle by myself, but what's relaxing about it is that someone else does the thinking for a whole hour, and that's and that's a great break from thinking, because thinking is exhausting. I mean, and I think the Arendtian answer is that you have to keep asking these questions. Well, what if? Well, what can we do? Well, what are the possibilities here? And I don't think there's no shortcut for that, at least not that I've discovered.
Yeah, and to that end, my answer is actually like a different direction than I would take, and I am implicating myself in this too before I say it. We have to put down our phones. I think that the biggest moral challenge of our times that we don't actually realize is how connected we are, how much we let an algorithm decide how we think about things, and we have outsourced so much of our thinking. And I do believe, like Arendt says, that thinking is how we get through this, because fascism operates when thinking and action collapse and there's no more thinking. And when we don't allow ourselves the time and space to do that thinking, and instead we spend our time going like this, or we create a culture where our young people are doing that actually is going to lead us further down that path than we think. And so my real answer is I don't know that we need to all go to Ottawa and be standing on at Parliament doing that, but I know that we absolutely need to be fighting for stricter cell phone restrictions on children, that we need to be figuring out how we're going to combat this and how we're going to readjust social cohesion so that if and when we need to rely on each other, we actually can.
Once again, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Marci.